I recently bought an iPhone 13 Pro after years of using an iPhone 10 to do quite a lot of street photogrammetry with. The workflow has always been cumbersome, capturing images on the iPhone, then finding a way to transfer it to a PC, processing with a photogrammetry software, and finalizing it with mesh and texture editing. Over the last year or so, since Apple launched a LIDAR unit on the iPad as well as the iPhone 12 Pro, there have been numerous apps and startups that have popped up to offer a new way of 3D scanning that's a lot quicker and much less cumbersome. Hopefully. The question I want to answer here today is personal. This time it's personal. I want to answer whether or not these apps will provide solutions that are good enough for me to use, that are going to pull me away from my cumbersome workflow and actually produce results that are usable. In this video, I'll be comparing two things: photogrammetry with the iPhone 13 processed on a PC using reality capture versus a iPhone LiDAR scanning app called Polycam. I understand that there are a lot more options for me to have picked from, both on PC with all the photogrammetry software, as well as on iOS with all the LiDAR scanning apps. I picked reality capture because it's the photogrammetry software that I have the most experience with. And I picked Polycam because it's quite popular, and also for the fact that it has a new secondary photo capture mode, which is essentially using Apple's Object Capture API. Originally, I wanted to compare everything. I wanted to compare the iPhone 10 to the iPhone 13 Pro. I wanted to compare the iPhone 13 Pro's cameras to each other versus the iPhone 10's cameras, and then across each other. I wanted to compare Polycam's LiDAR scanning to its photo capture mode, then everything together. However, because of the fact that this is now essentially the third reshoot of this video, and the scope kept getting larger and larger every time I discovered something, I decided to limit this video to just photogrammetry with iPhone photos processed on a computer versus iPhone LiDAR scanning, which was the original intent of the video anyway. So without further ado, let's dive in. All right, let's take a look at our first example here. So this is a door that I captured in Berlin, walking around as one does. And of course, it's full of graffiti and cool textures on the walls, lots of grime. And so all of these things are great for photogrammetry, of course. Before we look at the mesh itself, I think it's worth talking about the photos and sort of the format that they were captured in, as well as the method of capture. So the photos themselves are captured in Apple's ProRAW format, which is something new. The ProRAW format is great, although I'm not particularly using it here. It's a 12-bit RAW format that basically you can really adjust the highlights and shadows and whatnot. And this is putting the iPhone in like much more of a professional photography workflow environment, something that I'm typically used to with my A7R II as well as my drone photos. However, here to keep things simple, I'm basically just using the raw photos as they are, putting them into reality capture as the DNG format that they are, and reality capture basically takes this 12-bit photo, converts it to 8-bit internally, and uses it as such. In terms of capture method, this is sort of what I did. I started from the top, as I walked right, and then I walked left, then I walked right again, and as you can tell, I'm changing the angle and height of the camera of each pass. Then I get up close and I capture those diagonals, those obliques, and then I get up close next to the chandelier. So the reason why I also picked this area is because it's a mix of quite a few things. It's a door, the entrance, as well as like has a small detail. I wanted to test the capabilities of being able to reconstruct a dense thing as well as a much larger surrounding. So timing wise, it took me around 2 minutes to capture the photos and around 7.5 minutes for the alignment, reconstruction, and the texturing. And so with 74 photos, reality capture reconstructed a mesh of almost 20 million triangles with an optimal texture resolution of 1/16K texture, which is 4 8K textures. So now in Blender, basically the fairest way that I can try to compare this workflow with reality capture versus doing a LiDAR scan is to try to bring the poly counts to pretty much the same thing, as well as the texture resolution. And then taking a look at the alignment, the mesh quality, as well as the texture. That's as close to a one-to-one comparison that we can do. So for the reality capture mesh, I simplified it down to 160,000 triangles with one 4K texture, which is essentially matching the specs of the LiDAR scan. In terms of initial impressions, we were able to reconstruct the chandelier pretty well. I think it helped a lot that it had quite a lot of dust and grime on it. Of course, the graffiti on the walls are great. You know, this is photogrammetry after all. So now let's look at the LIDAR scan. Quick note on that, there's basically different settings in Polycam that adjust the voxel size that it uses and the decimation that it uses for each scan. So sometimes if you're scanning an object, you'd obviously want that to be much smaller. If you're scanning an area like this, you'd want it to be bigger. And so here I'm using their default space settings. Right off the bat, I'm noticing some issues which are related to alignment. So notice here how the door has depression inside. It's getting pushed in. It almost seems like there are two different scans. Like there's maybe the scan from out here did not match the scan when I was, you know, doing this sort of this oblique angle, and so this got basically misaligned and pushed in. There's a few other areas as well, like there's this, I'm noticing here, this wall has a little bit of a curve that comes around, and in fact, in the photogrammetry, it's actually two corners, it's not even one corner. So perhaps this is a voxel size thing. The voxel itself is too big for two corners to be reconstructed. So you might be asking, okay, what if you decrease the voxel size? And I did that. So here is basically the full settings that I can, this is the max settings that I can push out of Polycam. And in terms of what those settings were, yeah, I left the depth range the same. The voxel size is down to 8 millimeters and simplification at 0. So this is no simplification, and it produced a 1.1 million poly mesh. So right off the bat, I'm actually starting to notice more alignment issues. In fact, so I can tell that the triangles are smaller. And maybe we can take a quick peek at the geometry. So here's the geometry of the full version, and this is the default version. I believe, and don't quote me on this, I think they're reprocessing the alignment, essentially the registration when you're processing this. I had assumed that they were just using Apple's ARKit pose, essentially, like when you're walking around with the phone and ARKit. Perhaps they're doing another pass at that during processing, and so that's why you have two different results here. Like this, the default version didn't have this area. For reference, here's what the reality capture mesh looks like. There's quite a lot of detail on the doors that just do not get reconstructed in the LiDAR. And yeah, not to mention like smaller details, like there's a light up here, and as well as the chandelier is, here it is in the full version. Yeah, it's not really there. I think a good place to start in terms of analyzing this and determining is this usable or not, it is mostly having to do with what do you want to do with this? What are you using photogrammetry or 3D scanning for? Some of you are 3D artists and you want to be able to easily capture assets or capture backdrops to put your characters or assets on and skip the modeling. For that, of course, you would want to light those things. And for lighting, you need good geometry, and for good geometry, you need good alignment to have good geometry, and I'm not seeing that here in this example. On the other end of things, you might just want to have an unlit mesh, which, to be frank, I have a lot of unlit meshes that are essentially just photography. Like, I consider photogrammetry as just an extension of photographs. And I mean, here's like quite a lot of examples. Pretty much everything on my Sketchfab, almost everything on my Sketchfab, are unlit meshes. And by what I mean by unlit, it's captured with the lighting that was there in reality. So here, this was the real sun shining on this church. For these things, you can actually get away with a lot worse geometry underneath, because the baked lighting and the texture kind of adds all this detail that is just not there in the mesh. Here's an example. Like when we zoom in here, none of this is actually in the geometry. This is almost a flat mesh, but it's just the texture itself has all these like tiny shadows in it. So keep that in mind as we're going through this. I guess my final take on this is, would I use this on Sketchfab? In fact, I think I would rather use this space version rather than the full version for Sketchfab, just because it has much less shadowing, ghosting, much less issues, even the holes it looks like. But I mean, I don't know. I still don't like the fact that there's like misalignments here, and like there is quite a lot of stuff that's missing. I'm, by the way, not judging the shape of the mesh itself. That's Polycam has a crop feature inside of it, and also so does Reality Capture now. I'm just haven't really used it here. Yeah, for this first example, I think I would go with Reality Capture. For the next example here, I wanted to test out loop closure by walking around an object and scanning it. So this is a column from a walkway. And in fact, you might recognize this column if you follow me on Twitter. And I've scanned actually the entirety of the walkway, and each column is kind of its own cool little thing. So I went back here with my iPhone 12 Pro to essentially test out the new ultra wide camera's capabilities. It has a new sensor and it's supposed to be less noisy. So I wanted to see if I can do similar scans to that I would be using my DSLR for. This is a total of 86 images captured over 2 minutes, and Reality Capture produced a mesh of 8 million triangles, which I then also simplified to match the LIDAR's poly count. Now we're in Blender. I think right off the bat, something worth pointing out here is like the fact that this would be a really good place to use ProRAW. Notice that we have, you know, quite a bright area and a shadowy area to be able to both keep the high contrast balance of the texture if you're capturing it with the sunlight directly hitting on it, but also not sacrifice, let's say, alignment and mesh reconstruction quality. Again, I have not processed the ProRAWs, I'm just using them as they are. So let's take a look at the LIDAR. The LIDAR here, I actually was impressed that the loop closure worked. I think that's the thing that I've been worried about the most, that when you scan something and then you come around to it and you scan it again, that it'll just kind of create a double face, a double wall. And here that did not happen. And beyond that, I think one thing that's worth noting is that I was using the ultra wide camera for the photogrammetry scan, and the LIDAR scan was actually using the wide camera. That means it's technically using the better lens. And in fact, I wasn't all too happy with the texture resolution of the photogrammetry scan. If we take another look at that here, I mean, granted, this is only one 4K texture. Even looking at a higher texture resolution here, I think I was expecting a little bit more, but then again, I think this is already better than what the previous iPhone's ultra wide could do. So I don't know, maybe I'm spoiled by my 42 megapixel A7R2. But yeah, even just looking at the images, you can sort of see what's going on. You can tell that there's denoising happening, and in certain areas it's turning into like a watercolor painting. So the LIDAR scan here, I would say, is successful, and I would solidly put it into the usable bucket. One last thing to note is these little corners are not the double corners as well, and I guess this is due to the voxel size thing again. So for this example, as I was walking past it, it sort of caught my eye, and given its sort of greater context, I actually thought it was really pretty, and I wanted to scan it to have it be one of my pieces on Sketchfab. I set about to capture it not as a test, but as a proper street photogrammetry on plan scan, as I typically do with my phone. This was captured with a combination of the wide and the ultra wide cameras of the iPhone 13 Pro. It was 316 images captured over 7 minutes. So yeah, this was a proper scan. And just to kind of also let you know how I was thinking about this, most of the shots were done with the wide, because that's going to give you the best resolution shot, essentially, best resolution per centimeter shot. However, the ground I captured with the ultra wide. Reason being is because I always make the mistake of not capturing enough of the ground when I'm like scanning a facade like this. And I always regret it when I come home and I'm processing it. I'm like, man, I wish there was like another half a meter of ground. So the ultra wide is fantastic at being able to give you more square footage with not that many photos. And especially since it's the ground, you really don't need that much like resolution. Oh, I just lost, where did it go? Okay, whatever. So the mesh that Reality Capture produced was 40 million triangles, and the optimal texture resolution was 10 8K textures. So that's quite nice. I should mention here that because I knew I wanted to keep the scan, I wanted to do some cleanup on the mesh itself. So the cleanup that I did was all these windows that were essentially holes and bumpy, basically needed to be fixed. And because not only did I want to close the holes, but perhaps, you know, if I wanted to render something in Blender, I wanted the windows to be somewhat flat so that I could draw a roughness map and have them be reflective. But all in all, that took me around 20 minutes of doing mesh cleanup in Mesh Mixer, and then probably a few more minutes of importing into Reality Capture and baking textures and etc. So now in Blender, this is what the final result looks like. I'm quite happy with it. The vines are really, really beautiful. They have this very soft lighting on them. The windows are great. There's even this like nice little detail. Originally why I even wanted to capture this entrance and this door was because, well, there's this kid up here, which is pretty dope, but also there are boots on the ground. A lot of people in Berlin leave shoes, like unwanted shoes, outside of their door, and people just pick them up. So the LIDAR scan, this is the default settings. So here we start to see a lot of the sort of same misalignment issues. I mean, pretty much all throughout these windows, a lot of things don't really line up. I even noticed here that these two windows are two different sizes. I mean, if I compare it with the photogrammetry scan, pretty sure they're the same size, right? Yeah. They might be slightly, this one might be slightly bigger, but certainly not like this. I don't know why these sort of Roman Corinthian column things didn't really get meshed very well. The lines are looking pretty good. At least on the texture side, they're a nice flat projection onto the mesh. These are as well. But yeah, the rest, I mean, there's a lot of misalignments. I also have the full resolution version of the LiDAR. I wasn't able to max out the voxel size because it kept crashing. So this is, I think, around 10 millimeters. I can't say it's that much better. I think there was more texture resolution that it generated, but I'm seeing more alignment issues here as well. So something happened here where I think, let's take a look. I don't know. I don't even know how close the window is supposed to be actually. I guess if we compare it to photogrammetry, yeah, there's clearly just a lot of shifting happening. Yeah, that's not really good. Before I forget, let's also take a look at the mesh itself. So this is for the default space settings mesh. Here is the full mesh at around 1 million triangles, and this is the Reality Capture mesh down at 200,000 triangles. So I know, of course, I am comparing like the best case scenario here with the photogrammetry scan because I like actually spent time fixing it up. But to be frank, the only thing I fixed were the windows. Like I didn't touch anything else really. I cropped the edges and I closed the windows. That's the other thing that I think is worth talking about with LiDAR. Pretty much no photogrammetry scan is perfect. And if it is, then you really spent a lot of time on the capture side. You pretty much always need to factor in like cleanup time on if you really care enough about the model. When it comes to alignment issues like we're seeing here, honestly, this stuff is like not fixable. It's, you know, with photogrammetry, if I encounter alignment issues, and which happens more often than I'd care to admit, but at least there are settings that you can really adjust. There's documentation you can read up on that at least you can try and fix the alignment on the alignment side of things rather than on the mesh and the texture area. So like this stuff, I just wouldn't even know where to start fixing from. The windows, you can easily fix these blobby sort of things. That's really not that big of an issue. But this sort of texture misprojections from the misalignments are kind of killer. I mean, yeah, when you don't even have like a proper, photo of this decal that was like the central thing of the scan, unless you go back there and take another photo, you're not going to be able to like fix that. Yeah, in this example, I certainly wouldn't consider this to be usable, at least for my standards. All right, for the final example here, this is yet another door. Incredible. The reason I picked this door is beyond its beautiful, cleanliness, it also had metal window bars that I thought would be interesting to see if, first of all, do they show up in photogrammetry scans, but also do they show up in LIDAR scans. The photo capturing took 3 minutes and the total processing time was 15 minutes. Reality Capture produced a 30 million triangle mesh, 1 16K texture, yeah, 4 8K textures. This is a simplified version of that mesh. This is 200,000 triangles, and I believe 1 8K texture. Let's take a look at the LiDAR mesh. So the LiDAR mesh does not actually have any misalignment problems, which I was quite happy about. Everything seems to be there, nothing like no double walls. Let's take a quick peek at the geometry. So this is 42,000 triangles, and this is the photogrammetry one. Okay, fair enough. This is not a fair comparison. This is like 5 times more triangles. But I think if we look at the full LiDAR scan, so these are settings that I try to max out on without it crashing. So this is 600,000 triangles, and seeing this, I don't think this is a unfair comparison to show the Reality Capture's 200K triangle mesh compared to this, because it just goes to show that the LiDAR scanner cannot capture small geometry details the same way that you can get with photogrammetry. These sort of windows, even the bars are here somewhat meshed. You're just not getting that with LiDAR. Speaking of bars, yeah, the window bars came out in photogrammetry, but certainly did not in the LiDAR scan. But all in all, I do think this LiDAR scan looks pretty good. I think mostly due to textures, and the texture projection looks quite usable. With a little bit of cleanup, I think you can have this looking pretty good. In conclusion, what were my main takeaways here? At the very base level, the results that I saw with the LiDAR scans were not good enough to pull me away from my PC-based workflow. The main issue with the LiDAR scans was not so much the fact that the mesh resolution or the texture resolution wasn't good enough. I think they're good enough to do unlit meshes with for photography and memory taking and etc. However, the main issue with the LiDAR scans was the alignment. When you have bad alignment, you're not going to have good meshing, and you're also not going to have good texture projections, which is basically what we kept seeing over and over again. Bad texture projections on the walls, bad meshings when you have doubling of the walls. These aren't very easily fixable. Whether or not this can be improved, I'm not sure, but perhaps it might be, because at the end, this is sort of a solved problem on the photogrammetry side. You just need to throw more power and time into the actual alignment of the cameras. The good news is Apple released this Object Capture API, which is essentially their Mac-based photogrammetry processing tool. Even LiDAR scanning apps like Polycam have integrated into their app, essentially do what I've been doing with my iPhone to PC workflow, but in a much more integrated way. You take photos on the iPhone, it uploads those photos to a cloud-based Mac, which is essentially processing those photos through Object Capture API, and it produces a good photogrammetry result. So I know I didn't include it in this video to not increase the scope too much, but the results that I was seeing with photo capture were actually quite promising. When I matched the texture resolution 1-to-1 between Reality Capture and Object Capture API, I actually saw much higher sharpness in the photo capture mode than I did in Reality Capture. This was actually quite surprising to me, and I think this has something to do with Apple really innovating on the photogrammetry side. The Object Capture API meshes also produced a few different texture maps, including normals, ambient occlusion, and roughness. Reality Capture can also produce normals and displacement maps, but not AO and roughness. And the roughness mask, I'm not really sure how they're producing. It must be some machine learning estimations. I don't know. However, Object Capture API doesn't really give you that many options to really configure. And so with Reality Capture, you still can produce a higher quality mesh and a higher resolution texture just because you have access to all those settings. But it's something that I'm really interested in looking deeper into. And again, I think part of my results are skewed towards the things that I'm interested in, which is capturing places. I don't really do any object captures. I don't really do any scans of shoes and things like that. And I think there's quite a lot of people that do, and they've had pretty decent results with the LiDAR scanner in those scenarios. To me, it's just not the subjects that I typically capture with photogrammetry. Is the LiDAR scanning good enough for beginners to get started with? I think it is, and I think it can certainly get your feet wet into the world of 3D scanning. However, if you want to go down the prosumer or professional route, I think it's really worth it to learn how photogrammetry works, learn how to take photos and how to process them and how to produce meshes that way. I think one big benefit of learning how to use a photogrammetry software is that it doesn't really care where the photos come from. They could be photos from a phone, photos from a drone, photos from a plane, photos from a satellite, photos from a game, photos from a microscope. And so learning how to do photogrammetry in one medium means you can now do photogrammetry in all the other mediums as well. With LiDAR scanning, you're essentially just limited to that exact medium. One last thing to note here is I think one of the interesting things that the LiDAR on the iPhone opens up is use cases of stuff that I just had not considered. Not only is it like a Microsoft Kinect in your pocket that you can use to shoot volumetric video with, but because it also has ARKit, you can actually have the camera be tracked however it's moving. Second is that the LiDAR sensor is pretty great at actually generating depth maps for photos and videos, enabling things like cinematic mode on the iPhone 13 Pro, as well as, portrait mode. All of these things that I think pave the way for light field capture and for light field displays. And of course, the original intent of the LiDAR was for occlusion mapping, for being able to have instant AR, to be able to place AR objects in the space around you without having to do any sort of parallax movement with your phone. I think that's the main thing, is that even Apple doesn't think that LiDAR should really be used for photogrammetry, essentially, for object capture, because their object capture API is only photos, only photogrammetry. So they think LiDAR can be useful for all these other things. So is it a futile endeavor? I don't know. Maybe it'll improve, maybe not. I don't know. I'm not working on the LiDAR side of things, but I'm sure it's enabling certain use cases that I'm just not considering. And if that's so, please let me know in the comments. I mean, if there's certain things that you think I really should be looking at with the LiDAR, certain apps, certain use cases, certain things to do with it. And also on the LiDAR scanning side of things, have you also seen the same sort of alignment and meshing problems that I got? Are there big differences between the LiDAR scanning apps? I'd love to hear about it. And if there's a follow-up video that I need to make, I'm happy to do it. And again, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you got something out of it, and goodbye.